I think it took a few years in the beginning, maybe right out of undergrad, to say out loud to other people. But now it's so easy, and it's lovely. I'm Krista. My mom calls me Krista Lou.
Krista Lou.
Krista Louise Smith. Yeah. I was 4, and I was in ECE, which is Canadian Early Childhood Education. And I remember very, very well, I was wearing like one of those little play school plastic smocks, and the teacher had set up all these easels for these like tiny children to paint at. And I remember the paint was blue and it had that smell, you know, like that kids paint that that you can eat and not die. And I remember sticking the brush in, and it was like a sippy cup, so that it kind of like sucked the paint off of the brush a little bit so that the kids don't get too crazy. And I just remember putting the brush up to the newsprint and gliding it across. And I just remember the feeling of like the glide. And I was like, whoa. When I was younger, it was really easy to have art be part of my life because you don't have anything to do. You're a kid, you know. So, I mean, I remember filling my time with coloring books and paints, and my grandmother was very crafty, and she would, you know, teach me how to knit, or leave me in a room with like a bunch of seashells and a glue gun and be like, make something, you know. It wasn't until maybe once you start to go to school and you start to have other stresses or priorities, or you start to have responsibilities, that it kind of gets pushed a little bit to the side. But for me, I always remember drawing at school, at home, wherever I could. There wasn't a lot of programs in my schools, and I just remember I would take an assignment and somehow make it a drawing assignment, you know. So I didn't really have trouble making time for it ever. I remember telling my parents when I was younger that I always wanted to move to Malibu or somewhere warm, which still is real. But I guess that trip to Italy really opened up my eyes to just sort of more European lifestyle. I like the sort of traditional values of European culture, like just celebrating being alive and taking naps and the day off, and kind of like just that, you know, like we don't have that so much here. There's such a pressure here. Like if you're not working, you're not doing, you're not achieving, and that can put a lot of like poison in you. And there was something about Europe where it was like just enjoy, you know. Within the first 3 weeks of me living in Europe, it was like New York was tapping me on the shoulder. The first girl I made friends with in France was Polish, but she was raised in Brooklyn. And she just talked about how much she loved New York and missed New York, and what about the art schools in New York. And I was there painting, and I applied for a grant, and I got the grant. And then I applied to grad school, and I got into grad school. So it all kind of fell into place while I was living in Europe. I thought maybe that was where I wanted to be, and I quickly recognized it wasn't, and it was like New York sort of just grabbed me and like took me over. So it was really a very organic process. I feel like I really started my adult artist life in New York City, and so that's why I feel most connected here, you know. Within the first 3 weeks of me living here, I remember feeling the change. I remember feeling like you're finally where you're supposed to be, and I don't deny that feeling. I still have that feeling. I just don't think about it anymore because I just am here. My husband's here. You know, we've like built this life together. We came here at the same time. I think he was maybe living in New York for a month before I got here, something like this. And we met, and then that was it. I've never been, you know, close to anyone like him since arriving here. So it just feels like home, you know? Like we're a little family, but we're like all we have. And we both love it here. And it's nice to just like wake up and go to the Met or go to a gallery or go to your studio or go see an indie movie or do the things that you love to do. Those things are here. So I wouldn't leave. At 18 or at 17, when you're like filling out those applications to go to college, right? Like we think about this now and it's like, God, how the hell are you supposed to know what you want to do, right? But I always knew that I was an artist, but I didn't know that I didn't know what it looked like to be an artist in the time that I am currently living in or at that time, because it wasn't around me. You know, so I was in the suburbs and, you know, we never went to museums. We never went, like the most cultural thing that my parents would have us do is like we'd go see a play, which I always loved. But, you know, there wasn't a lot of guidance like into that road. And so I think for me it was like, well, my dad builds houses and I should just go into interior design because there's kind of like a creative outlet there and it makes sense and my parents will pay for me to go to school there or something. I was just drawing or painting to do it because I had to, you know. I don't think I was thinking about what's not around me consciously when I was making work, but I was very consciously aware that there wasn't a lot of art around me. But it was such an insular thing, like you just sit at a table and start making. You don't need really anything, but definitely there was like a missing part, and you can't make it appear. And I think I realized that pretty young, that this is where I'm from and this is great, but I need more, and so you have to go to it. So when the opportunity to go to Italy or go to any major city came around, I was the first person to sign up and go. And then when I would go to these bigger cities or places where there was more cultural value to me, I just kept going and eventually moved to like the most overly saturated, you know, like place in the world. I feel like there's been a huge shift in my work in the last year, and I.
How did that start, the shift, or why did that start?
I mean, it was a combination of things, like my arm. I've been suffering from mysterious arm condition, don't know what it is, the neck, the shoulder, the spine, under the brachial plexus, whatever. So I've been sort of dealing with this for a while and was relying on my arm and that skill and making these sort of photorealistic paintings for a long time. And it became too hard to work that way. And I was also getting stifled by that work. I wasn't feeling challenged by that work anymore. It had run its course, essentially. Within myself, I kind of have like a bleakly dark sense of humor. But there was absolutely no humor before, and now the humor, I don't know, maybe the humor is like a gateway into the work. I think that especially because men and women view the work differently, and I think that's inherent to like our being and our experiences and all that stuff. But there's something about the humor that brings a lot more people in. I think you just have to make work. Like, you have to carve out space, mental space, physical space, to just make in, and you just keep going, you know? I didn't even know that this is what this looks like, you know? You just figure it out. And that's the shittiest advice, I think, because like I hated so much when people would say, you're gonna be fine, you know, or you'll figure it out. But it's unfortunately just true. It absolutely is unlike many professions where there's a clear path to how you arrive, you know, like there's a ladder and there's these steps and there's, you know, a certain amount of time you have to put in here and then here and then here, and eventually you get there and then you've got the money and you've got the, you know, whatever. Yeah, all that stuff, and like, that's really not how this works. I mean, you can absolutely still want those things and get those things, but in my experience, it's just not been how it works. In my immediate future, I would like to have my own studio, because sharing a space, as much as I love sharing a space with my husband, and we've spoken about this a lot, our work, we are not collaborators by any means, but it is kind of extraordinary to work in the same room as your spouse who's an artist and see how they're thinking and interpreting things, and how that kind of through osmosis affects how you're seeing and interpreting things and what you're making. And even if they don't look anything the same, there's like this strange kind of communion between our work. So I wouldn't want to like lose him, you know, too much, but maybe if our studios were like down the hall from each other or something, so that I could just close the door and like have a space that's a little more private. I would have never guessed that my work now looks the way it does. If you told me 5 years ago and showed me a snapshot of these works, I would think you were out of your fucking mind, you know, like I wouldn't have believed you. So I have no idea what my work will look like years from now, which is exciting. But in terms of like maybe like the last 5 or 10 years, like taking this beginning stages of my work in my life, I don't know. I mean, the common thread would be absolutely, I think this grappling with femininity and what that means, and a kind of reckoning with like womanhood. It's in there. Like I think that's what has stayed from the last work into this work.